Thank you very much. Our last speaker has promised to keep the time limit. He's not just a token man, but highly qualified. Lord Daniel Finkelstein is a British journalist and politician who sits in the upper house as a Conservative. He served as advisor to Prime Minister John Major and was elevated to a peerage by Prime Minister David Cameron in 2013. He's a renowned political commentator and former chairman of the UK-based think tank Policy Exchange. He's also a vice president of the Jewish Leadership Council and writes for the Times, of course, and the Jewish Chronicle. Welcome, Lord Finkelstein.
Well, thank you very much, Karina, and it was very stimulating to hear my two co-speakers. It's also delightful to be here with so many people. I did once give a speech in Norwich in the UK, which involved me travelling for 4.5 hours to get there, and when I got there were only 2 people. And one of them was the person that invited me. The other one, he waited until I'd finished speaking, and I asked him whether he wanted to join the cause I was there for, and he said he would, but it would interfere with the terms of his parole. So I'm pleased that I've got hopefully certainly a bigger audience, hopefully with fewer criminal convictions. I'm going to talk about 3 things. Briefly, who I am, then what has happened in Britain, and finally, the intellectual origins of the rise of left anti-Semitism. I'm the son of 2 refugees. One is a survivor of concentration camps, the other of Stalin's deportations to the east. And I live in a quiet London suburbs, and I value it. And as I said in my maiden speech in the House of Lords, my mother was in Belsen and my father was in Siberia, and Pinner is nicer. So I put a high value on stability and on peace. My father's mother, my grandmother, always used to say, while the Queen is safe in Buckingham Palace, we're safe in Hendon Central. And on my 50th birthday, I told my guests how lucky I was that the fate that had befallen my parents and my grandparents had not befallen me, and that it never would. And it was unthinkable. And I think if I'd been giving that 8 years ago, if I'd been giving that address to my friends now, I wouldn't talk with the same confidence. I might not even say the same things. Perhaps that's a little bit unrealistic, but it's certainly how lots of Jews in Britain feel. It's not just a feeling about the immediacy of politics. It's a general feeling abroad about politics and politicians and about democracy. And I just wonder what the alternative is to politicians. If a man on a white horse arrives to cleanse the nation and sweep away corruptions, we all know who will be doing the sweeping and who the swept will be. So I'm nervous about the rise of nationalism and populism in Europe. I fear the rise of a crude right, and I don't take any comfort from the fact that in Britain, the right is too busy hating Muslims to spend too much time on Jews. And that would be a false comfort to take indeed. It is, however, I think, a reasonable observation of the political scene. It does mean that it has been left anti-Semitism that has had the most immediate impact on Jews. And let me provide a short, very short necessarily, history. In 2015, the Labour Party held a leadership contest after it had lost another election. And it allowed new members to join for only £3, and they could vote in the leadership election. It was, as you might guess, flooded with hundreds of thousands of people, and they elected as their leader a man called Jeremy Corbyn. Someone who most of them knew very little about, save that he was a radical, he was breaking sharply with the Blair-Clinton consensus. But a few people did know him because they had been his comrades in decades of struggle on the far left. David Graeber wrote an article recently, I think it was in the New York Review of Books, and he said it was a bit like electing Chomsky to be leader of the party, right? So it was somebody who had been familiar to quite a niche audience, was not generally known by a bigger audience, but came with a lot more baggage than somebody who might just simply be a figure of the somewhat more radical, somewhat more demonstrative left. Corbyn's central campaigns had all been about foreign policy issues. And slowly but surely, it turned out that quite a lot of the campaigns and the activities that he had been involved in touched upon Jews. He'd welcomed Hamas and Hezbollah to Parliament and described them as friends. He'd consorted and defended with Holocaust deniers, with blood libelists, and with 9/11 conspiracy theorists, explicitly defending and supporting each of those people in each of those categories. He then, and this was, I think, a climactic event, was revealed to have defended an anti-Semitic mural, the content of which would not have looked out of place in Die Stürmer. And he had also laid a wreath at the site of the Munich murderers. Now, his leadership brought vocal support for him and for these positions. There was an odd thing on the left where people would say he really didn't do it, and if he did, he was right. And they seem to want to have it both ways. But as it pulled in people into the party who were copying the leader or justifying the leader or merely coming from the same political position as the leader, and people began to complain about those. Jeremy Corbyn's reaction was to do nothing. His team claimed that the Labour Party had a tough procedure for dealing with comments on social media, which began to explode with use of terms of Rothschild Jews and comparisons of the Jews to the Nazis. But all the time, it would take maybe a year for somebody to be investigated for having put a meme on social media of the Statue of Liberty with a Zionist insect on its face, and they needed a year to study whether that was anti-Semitic, and at the end of this year they would often give a light sanction, so they would have to go on a training course provided by other far-left activists who became something called the Jewish Voice for Labour, which was outside the official Jewish Labour movement, which is 100 years old this week, but they gave this training to another group entirely. As the Jewish community explained and complained, the Corbynistas attacked back. So the Jews were Trump supporters. This was quite an often used. The rabbis were Tory stooges. And Jewish activists felt under increasing assault in their own constituencies. And several, as Julie said, several Jewish members of parliament quit the party. The one encouraging part of this story is that it turned out to matter. Politically, it turned out to matter. For those of us who are used to the fact that people pay very little attention to politics, I was completely stoic about the fact that our first opinion polls showed that people didn't know what anti-Semitism was. They never met any Jews. The word didn't mean anything to them. We, in fact, began to use the term anti-Jewish racism. People didn't know there was such a thing, but they were against it insofar as they were told that it existed. They didn't like racism, but they didn't recognize the terminology. But slowly but surely, this began to change for two reasons. First, it became a matter of competence. How could Jeremy Corbyn say that he was against racism and then he couldn't remove obviously racist people from the party? How could his complaints procedure be such a mess? People thought he was probably quite incompetent, that he couldn't do anything. This seemed to prove it. So for a rather odd reason, this undermined his leadership. The other thing is that people thought it wasn't very prime ministerial to be engaged in this kind of battle with one section of the population. People don't have any idea how many Jews there are in Britain anyway, but they thought this was unbecoming. And so in the end, particularly because the chief rabbi spoke out bravely during the election campaign, bravely and unprecedentedly, it turned out that it did matter politically. And it was, I think, behind his general position and his position on Brexit, where he called for a second referendum when half of his own voters didn't want that, it was a reason why he went down to defeat. And that is a reassuring aspect. It did turn out to matter. But it still leaves a puzzling question, which is, how can progressive people be anti-Semitic? And Deborah provided, I think, some brilliant insights, and I just want to add to those another another wing of that particular argument. And it came to me when I was reading a slightly arcane book, The Communist Party of Great Britain, an Historical Analysis to 1941. And it was written by a man called Andrew Murray. Andrew Murray was one of the chief advisors, is in fact one of the chief advisors to Jeremy Corbyn, somebody who'd been a member of the Communist Party up until the time that Jeremy Corbyn became leader. He, in this book, defends the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In 1995, he's still describing the fall of the Berlin Wall as an historic setback for human progress. But nevertheless, this extraordinary book did open my eyes, where I finally think I understood this big mystery. And it's all to do with Lenin's theory of imperialism. You might find it odd to mention Lenin, but as Andrew Murray himself in his most recent book mentions him 80 times, I don't feel that attaching it to Jeremy Corbyn is unreasonable. Lenin argued that capitalism is only economically sustainable because companies seek profits abroad. They then need governments to protect their foreign investments through military adventure. So imperialism protects capitalism, and to bring down capitalism, you have to bring down imperialism. So anti-colonial resistance movements are the one true type of anti-capitalist movement that actually works. Iran, Hugo Chavez, Hezbollah. Why does this lend itself to anti-Semitism? Well, first, because anti-imperialists, people like J.A. Hobson, to whose book on imperialism Jeremy Corbyn had wrote a preface, not noting that J.A. Hobson was one of the most notorious anti-Semites of his day. They have always seen Jews as the owners of the finance houses on whose behalf racist imperialism is conducted. In other words, these particular anti-imperialists are anti-racists who blame the Jews for racism. The second thing is because anti-imperialists see the great world empire now as the United States. It sees the Middle East as the center of this empire, and it sees Israel and Zionism, the Jews in other words, as the great creators and symbols of this imperialism. So for reasons that begin in a progressive analysis of capitalism, they end up in a position where they have anti-Semitic allies, where they believe anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, where they have anti-Semitic tropes, something that had perplexed me before I read and understood what Andrew Murray had written became a lot clearer to me once I've done so. But what it means is that left anti-Semitism isn't a few stray tweets, it isn't a gaffe, it isn't an organizational failure, it is a complex, deeply held system of thought that even now Jeremy Corbyn has been defeated, will still have to be taken on and eradicated. Thank you.